and anyone wishing to press this amendment to a division should make that clear in the debate. Clause 1, Amendment 2, Lord Randall of Uxbridge.
My Lords, I beg to move Amendment 2 standing in my name. I make no apology for returning to the subject that I raised at second reading, namely that of the injustice of frozen UK pensions overseas. First, I'd like to thank my noble friend, the Minister, for kindly arranging a meeting with me and some of her officials. I am very grateful to her for listening so intently, and I certainly understand that what I'm asking for is not something she can accede to in this debate. This amendment is not actually the one that I would have liked to have tabled, but the ever-helpful table office pointed out that the one I wanted to put down would not be in the scope of the bill. In fact, I would have liked to lift the amendment tabled in the other place by the Scottish Nationalist Party, which read, "No power may be exercised under this or any other act so as to exempt persons not ordinarily resident in Great Britain from entitlement to uprating increases granted by an order made by virtue of Section 2A of this Act." When replying, my honourable friend, the Pensions Minister, Guy Opperman, stated in rejecting the amendment, "This is a long-standing policy pursued by successive post-war governments who have taken the view that priority should be given to those living in the United Kingdom in drawing up expenditure plans for pensioner benefits. There are no plans to change that policy. The uprating of the state pension is intended to provide support for pensioners who live in the UK." Now, my lords, I do think his statement was factually incorrect, as we know that uprating exists for those who do live outside the UK, but only in countries where there is a reciprocal agreement. My amendment really seeks to clarify that, and I trust my noble friend can do that this afternoon. In the second reading debate, I followed the speech of my noble friend Viscount Trenchard, who mentioned the unfair situation with special regard to those who have served this country in armed forces. I mentioned my hometown of Uxbridge and its own strong RAF connections. So as one of the several case studies that I will mention this afternoon, I just want to recall the situation with Wing Commander Harry Penny, who was the commanding officer of RAF Uxbridge in his last years in the UK before he emigrated to Australia. Interestingly, when he arrived in Australia, he was encouraged to continue making national insurance voluntary contributions to boost his national insurance record, and so ended up with a full UK pension in the 1980s when he reached 65. But he was never advised that it would be frozen. Now, as we approach Remembrance Sunday, I'm sure all noble lords will be aware of the Battle of Kohima, and of course those deeply moving words from the Kohima Memorial will be uttered around the world. Well, Patricia Coulthard was present at the Battle of Kohima, and she is now fighting for veterans who retired abroad and have had their state pensions frozen. Ms. Coulthard, who moved to Australia to be near her two children, told our Prime Minister earlier in this year that she receives just £46 a week. This payment contrasts with the full state pension in the UK today of £175.20 per week. This amazing 99-year-old lady is just one of the more than 60,000 veterans who also suffer from frozen pensions. Miss Coulthard cared for soldiers who were injured at Dunkirk before being sent to India, where she served in a jungle field hospital during the Battle of Kohima, in which around 4,000 of the British and Indian forces lost their lives. She suffered malaria, dysentery, fever and pleurisy, but she remembers her comrades and experiences with pride. Roger Edwards risked his life for his country in the Falklands War, taking part in some of the conflict's most hazardous operations, including the SAS raids on Pebble Island and Goose Green and the retaking of South Georgia. Roger is 70 now, and if he lives to a ripe old age, he could potentially end up being out of pocket by as much as £7,000 a year. Mr. Edwards, who was born in Wiltshire, didn't lose his full pension entitlement because he moved to a foreign country with no connection to the UK. No, Mr. Edwards lives in the very place he risked his life for, the Falkland Islands. Yes, my lords, a UK overseas territory. This means he has full British citizenship. Yet that hasn't stopped the UK government from freezing his basic state pension. And Mr. Edwards isn't alone. There are 42 people living on those islands with a frozen UK pension, about half of whom are military veterans. Elsewhere in our overseas territories, our fellow citizens living in places as diverse as Montserrat in the Caribbean and the South Atlantic island of St. Helena, also have to make do with frozen pensions. Bizarrely, though, this policy doesn't apply to all 14 overseas territories. For example, those living in Bermuda, 5,800 miles north of Falklands, and one of the world's wealthiest places, enjoy the triple lock pension increases their counterparts in the UK receive. All told, there are around 680 UK pensioners living in UK overseas territories with frozen pensions, even though they have made the same national insurance contributions as their UK peers. That we have pensioners and military veterans like Patricia Coulthard living on as little as £46 a week is utterly shameful and must serve as a wake-up call to end this callous, cruel and immoral policy without delay. But it's not just our veterans who suffer this injustice. I've mentioned before there's deep concern that members of the Windrush generation who spent their working lives in the UK but retired abroad are also losing out through frozen pensions. I could continue with lots of cases of individuals. There are around about 500,000 who are so affected. However, I contend, my lords, it's only right that every pensioner is more than a number on a spreadsheet in Westminster, or Whitehall to be more correct, and it's high time that the government held up their end of the bargain and gave all pensioners the pensions they are entitled to. Many pensions said they did not know the situation when they left the country. Today, yes, there's information on gov.uk about what the effect of going abroad will be on their entitlement. And it says the government continues to uprate state pensions overseas where there is a legal requirement to do so. For example, in countries where there is a reciprocal agreement that allows for uprating. However, it appears that that information has not always been available for those leaving our shores. My lords, it's time we changed our policy, as the time-honoured reason given for this shameful state of affairs has been nothing but a blister on this country's good name for fairness. Now, I know that appealing to successive governments to do the right thing has simply not worked. Warm words at best sometimes, but certainly no action. So I want to suggest to the government something it could and should do to be more positive about it. How about proactively trying to get reciprocal agreements? Having left the EU seems to be the perfect time to think about it. Apparently, the last time an agreement was signed was in 1992 with Barbados. My lords, in 1992, I was still a slim young man selling furniture in Uxbridge. And although, luckily, through the miracle of Zoom, you cannot see my current frame, I'm sure you will realise that was a long time ago. I've changed somewhat, but the governments of the day still resolutely refuse to even try to rectify this situation. I would say, my lords, to the government, I'd be happy to be part of any team to get these agreements signed and sealed. And with a substantial number of new ones, perhaps the government will concede that all UK pensions abroad should be treated equally and fairly. However, I do fear the will is not there. I have seen a communication from a Canadian MP who states, I am told that the UK has continually declined overtures to open this issue, and that it will not consider the indexation of UK pensions paid into Canada. I understand, he says, goes on to say that a number of members of Parliament have raised this issue in recent months. Canada first opened the door to this possibility with the UK when the Conservatives were in government in 2013. And the UK declined our offer to enter into negotiations about this. Now, I can't say whether that's the case. Perhaps we can have some clarification on that, and indeed whether any other overtures by other countries have been rejected similarly. In the second reading debate, it was a great pleasure to hear the maiden speech of the noble Lord Field of Birkenhead, who, among many of his achievements in the other place, was chairing the Select Committee on Social Security. In one of its reports on this issue, under his chairmanship, it was stated that it is a political question which includes, but is not distinct from, a moral question. As always, the noble Lord put his experienced finger on the button. Now, I feel I have detained the House long enough on this, but I would like to ask whether civil service pensions are similarly frozen. Indeed, are those of members of Parliament? I wonder if any of my former colleagues decided to emigrate for whatever reason, and I know one or two of them threatened to do it periodically. Would they be so pleased if they knew that their pensions would be frozen? Are service pensions the same Perhaps my noble friend can find the answers to that to see whether it is just the state pension that discriminates in this way. I'd also add that if a UK pensioner returns to the UK for a holiday or some other reason, then for the period that they are here, the pension will be paid at the uprated sum, assuming, of course, that they contact the pension centre. Surely, this again discriminates against those who are too elderly to travel and those who cannot afford it, the very people we should be fully supporting. My lords, this issue has been around for far too long, and it's about time that we as a parliament and a nation decided that this issue should be resolved and discrimination in our pension system abolished for all time. Thank you.
Amendment proposed, page 1, line 24, at the end, insert the words as printed on the Marshal's list. I call the next speaker, Baroness Jank.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to thank the noble lord for his very interesting and eloquent speech. I remember at second reading he was equally impassioned, and it's very good that he's put this amendment down, which on the face of it seems extremely unjust, unfair, inconsistent and totally unjustifiable. So I would like to just maybe ask the noble lady, the minister, if she could give us a bit more of an explanation of this policy, how it's happened, because it does seem like some kind of an anomaly. How many pensioners affected in total? What is the future outlook? What would be the implications if this amendment were to be agreed to? I too looked at the Commons, the debate in the other place, and I found the minister's response dismissive and completely uninformative. So I think it would be very good if we could have a bit more information about this current situation. Noble Lord has mentioned particularly veterans, and again, this does seem completely unjust and completely lacking in any kind of compassion or any kind of gratitude to what these people have done for their country. So again, if we could be allowed to know how many of these people are veterans. Noble Lord mentioned government reciprocal agreements. I think that's right, but again, you need the political will, and whether that is there or not, it does seem in doubt. It certainly is a moral question. What I would also like to add here is the fact that so many UK citizens are not allowed to vote, unlike other countries where, for example, in France, they actually have an MP for citizens living abroad. I feel if these people were able to exercise their votes, then there might be a bit more political will to do justice for them all. Thank you.
I call the next speaker, Baroness Sherlock.
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord, Lord Randall of Uxbridge, for explaining his amendment to us. The Noble Lord is a strong advocate for this cause, and I find myself very sympathetic to the position in which many pensioners find themselves. But it is a difficult issue which successive governments have struggled to resolve. So I wonder if I could just ask the Minister some specific questions. First, the number has been used of 500,000 people living in other countries who are affected in this way. Could the Minister confirm that figure? And how much does she believe it would cost now to change the rules? The Noble Lord, Lord Randall, highlighted both today and at second reading two particularly difficult sets of cases. First, the position of veterans. He mentioned today Harry Penny or Roger Edwards, Patricia Coulthard and others. And I'm still thinking about Anne Puckridge, whom he mentioned at second reading, the 95-year-old World War II veteran whose pension was frozen when she moved to Canada at the age of 76 to be near her family. And it is hard to see the justice in those who fought for this country being denied pensions that they've earned simply because they moved abroad to be with their families in their later years and didn't realise what was going to happen. Does the government know how many veterans are in this position? Secondly, he also mentioned at second reading the case of Monica Phillips, who emigrated to the UK in 1959 as part of the Windrush generation, and then after 37 years working here, returned to Antigua to look after her mum, and her pension was then frozen. So again, does the government know how many of the Windrush generation are affected by this? Have they looked into this? The noble lord today also raised the issue of reciprocal agreements after Brexit. I have to say to him, I have pursued the issue of reciprocal agreements in the wake of Brexit for some time, but I've got precisely nowhere. All ministers will ever say is they hope to get a deal, so the position will be as set out in the negotiating documents. But I'll be very interested to see if he gets any more information than I've been able to manage. My lords, this is so difficult because so many people assume their pension is determined by what they pay in national insurance contributions rather than where they live when they retire. So can the Minister assure the House that the position is now made abundantly clear to all pensioners, especially as they approach pension age? I look forward to her reply.
Minister, Baroness Steedman-Scott.
My Lords, I turn to the amendment to Clause 1 tabled by Lord Randall of Uxbridge, and I should first say, as the noble Lord is aware, the amendment would in practice have no effect because it simply commits the government to uprating UK state pensions as it does now. But the noble Lord spoke passionately at second reading and again with great passion and commitment in this committee stage. The noble Lord eloquently shared with us case studies of people who are impacted by the lack of reciprocal arrangements and the freezing of pensions. But I must say that the long-standing policy of over 70 years of successive governments that the UK state pension are payable worldwide and are uprated in countries overseas where there is a legal requirement to do so. For example, in countries where the UK has a reciprocal agreement that requires uprating. I look forward to the debate on the issue, but first I would like to make some points about our reciprocal agreements with other countries. The UK has reciprocal agreements with several countries, and most of these require uprating. There are only 2 reciprocal agreements which do not allow for uprating, those with Canada and New Zealand. A similar agreement existed in Australia until early 2001, and the Australian government withdrew from this agreement. Unlike the UK, Canada and New Zealand have residence-based state pensions. The reciprocal agreements with them broadly allow for periods of residence of employment or contributions in one country to be considered as periods of residence, etc., in the other for the purposes of entitlement to a state pension. The systems in New Zealand and Canada are also means-tested to some extent. For example, New Zealand takes overseas pensions fully into account in its superannuation schemes. New Zealand law also requires that notional income is calculated if a pensioner does not claim his or her state pension from an overseas country. This means that any future state pension increases would be taken into account and the monies would go to the respective treasuries. And so pensioners on the lowest incomes are unlikely to benefit from increases in their UK state pension. It might also mean an increased tax bill for some overseas residents and the loss of their welfare benefits in their chosen country of residence. This government believes that its responsibility is to pensioners living in this country rather than effectively making payments to other treasuries. The agreements with Canada and New Zealand were negotiated and agreed some time ago, and the pattern of the UK's reciprocal agreements with other countries is historic. It is in part based on Commonwealth ties, but also on the political context at the time of concluding the agreement. This gives rise to inconsistencies. For example, we have an agreement with some Caribbean countries like Jamaica, but not with others. The agreement with Jamaica does require uprating. It has been suggested by some that uprating could form part of discussions on future free trade agreements with Australia and Canada, for example. However, state pensions are not in scope of free trade agreements. There are no plans to change the policy on uprating UK state pensions overseas. The government has not entered into a new reciprocal social security agreement since, as the Noble Lord Randall referred to, 1992, and has no plans to enter into new agreements. Noble Baroness Sherlock asked about the number of pensions living in frozen rate countries. It is approximately 500,000. and I regret that I do not have any numbers for veterans. Lord Randall raised the question of a moral obligation, as did other noble lords, to rectify this anomaly. The policy on this issue is long-standing, as I've already said, one of successive governments, and the current policy has been in place for around 70 years, and I know it will disappoint noble lords, but there are no plans to change it. The noble Lord Randall and Baroness Sherlock talked about the impacts on the Windrush generation, and UK state pensions are payable worldwide to eligible people based on their NI record. And I regret to tell the noble Baroness Sherlock that we do not know the numbers on the people affected by the Windrush community. Lord Randall asked about pensioners who are resident overseas who've paid their NI contributions, so pensions payable abroad should be fully indexed. The rate of contribution paid has never earned entitlement to the indexation of pensions payable abroad. This reflects the fact that the UK scheme is primarily designed for those living in the UK. Noble Lord Randall raised the issue of consistencies across countries, and he raised the particular point about Canada. For example, Canada has a bilateral agreement with the UK that doesn't cover uprating. The UK sought a reciprocal agreement including uprating with Canada, but this was rejected as legislation prevented Canada from paying its pensions overseas. The noble Lord Randall and other noble lords raised the issue about the government's moral right to uprate state pensions overseas. The decision to move abroad is voluntary and remains a personal choice dependent on circumstances of the individual. For a number of years, advice has been provided to the public that the UK state pension is not uprated overseas, except where there is a legal requirement to do so. My Lords, given that the amendment actually says that any uprating order made under this bill would uprate abroad where there is already a legal requirement to uprate, which is what the government is already required to do in law, I urge the noble lord to withdraw it because it has no practical effect, but welcome the opportunity presented by the noble lord to debate the broader issue of uprating overseas.
Thank you. My Lords, I've had no requests to speak after the Minister. I now call Lord Randall.
Thank you, my Lords. Well, I normally find that if I don't have high expectations, I won't be readily disappointed. And I thank my noble friend, the Minister, for her replies. I wasn't expecting any great change in 70 years of government policy of all parties, but I do think this is something that we should be looking at. As was said, that as part of our manifesto commitment, the Conservative manifesto commitment, to give the vote to people living overseas, perhaps that may be the incentive for us to look again at this particular issue. I am disappointed that there seems to be no desire to try to get reciprocal agreements. And I do take the point that free trade agreements won't include this sort of thing. But I think good diplomacy between countries, even if it's not actually in the agreement, is something that we should be looking at. And I'd urge those countries, particularly the Commonwealth countries out there who know that we want to be doing a trade with them, might just sneak it into the conversation that they might be a bit more willing to be helpful if they had a look at some of these things. But as I said, my Lords, I wasn't expecting it. I'm very grateful. I'm grateful for the other contributions in this debate. And it is something that not at report stage, I'm sure you'll be delighted to know, but it is something that I will not let go and will take up at any opportunity until this is solved. Thank you, my Lords. I therefore beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
Is it your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment by leave withdrawn. We now come to the group beginning with Amendment 3. I remind noble lords that anyone wishing to speak after the Minister should email the clerk during the debate. Anyone wishing to press this or anything else in the group to a division should make that clear